continuing with our discussion about society and culture around the world, we're going to focus now on Latin America. And with me today to discuss this part of the world is Professor Clemencia Rodriguez, a professor of communication and women and gender studies, and Professor Marcelo Rioseco, a professor of Spanish literature and language. So thank you for joining me today. Professor Rodriguez, we're going to start with you. You're from Colombia, and so we're going to talk a little bit about, maybe you could tell us a little bit about Colombian culture and society. What are some of the characteristics of Colombian culture and society?
Okay, so that's a very difficult question to answer, and so I'm going to kind of shift the focus of the question a little bit. There's a very famous Argentinian writer called Jorge Luis Borges, and he knew a lot about Colombia, spent time in Colombia, and knew a lot of Colombians, and he had a very phrase. He said something that became a very famous kind of thing for us to say about Colombians, and that is that being a Colombian is an act of faith. And so what that means is that there's really nothing substantial that you can call Colombianness, or that is the essence of Colombian culture. In Colombia it's a nation made up of very different regions, and the regions have their own specific culture, their own idiosyncrasies, and the differences between people, culture, cuisine, music, ways to see and to understand life and death and love and everything in one culture are so sharply different from other cultures that it's almost like we have to believe that there's something called Colombia that we all belong to, but beyond that belief, there's really nothing there.
Very interesting. Professor Rioseco, would you say the same is true about Chile?
I would say the same. I would say this is quite difficult to define Chilean culture. I would say that Chileans are not really interested in defining the culture. They think they are Chileans, whatever that means. And at the same time, there is a strange sensation in a country like mine, which is that some people think that the country probably doesn't really exist. I was this summer with a Jewish Chilean writer, and he said, I don't know if the culture of Chile, the meaning of the country exists really for me. Meaning probably that we know the country, we live the country, but there is something that is running away from us all the time. So I would say that I totally agree with Clemencia.
So these are two very diverse countries, is what I'm hearing from you. That within the countries you have a lot of differences, and you can't really sum up what each society and culture might represent. But let's kind of extend this discussion to Latin American society and culture. I mean, both of these countries are part of the region of Latin America. How can you describe at all what Latin American culture is? Is that, do Colombians, do Chileans see themselves as Latin American first or foremost, or do they see themselves as Colombian or a certain part of the region of Colombia? I mean, how would you connect Latin American culture and society? Is there such a thing as, certain cultural concepts? I mean, most of Latin America speaks Spanish, for example. Are there things that bind Latin Americans together? Language, religion, perhaps? What do you think?
Well, I think that we, as Latin Americans, we discover Latin America when we leave it, when we're out of it. When growing up in Colombia, I never really felt that I was a Latin American. I was not paying attention to what that is. I learned a lot of history of Colombia and geography of Colombia, but you don't have a point of view that allows you to see that you're part of a region. And so when I came to the US to pursue graduate studies, that's when I discovered that from this perspective here, then you can look down and you say, okay, there's something there called Latin America. And I think because the contrast with the lifestyle and the way of being and the way of socializing, or for example, even partying with the US is so strong, that's when you start realizing, okay, we don't belong here, we act very different from the people here. and you start interacting with other people from other regions of Latin America, with Mexicans and Chileans and Argentinians and Bolivians, and they start saying the same. We don't belong here either. Our way of partying is not like the people here. And that's when you start kind of putting together this notion of Latin America. I think the language is part of it, but if you think like about English, for example, speaking English doesn't necessarily mean that you belong to the same culture, because then you would have to say Australia, New Zealand, England, and the US, and South or India. I mean, that they all speak English, and that doesn't mean much beyond you speak English. So that's what happens with those type of questions. Every time you try to answer the question, you're only gonna grasp a tiny bit of the answer, and the bit is so small that it really is not an answer. So you end up with the same question. I would say, the last thing I'm gonna say about this is, in order to learn or to really understand what Colombia is or what Chile, you have to go, or what Latin America is. That's the only way.
And this is the best country to discover that, because you really meet a lot of people from different countries. But when you are in Chile or you're in Colombia and Argentina, Argentina is Argentina, Chile is Chile, and people say, I am Chilean, I am Argentinian. And when you ask them about Latin America, they don't really understand the question. Because I ask a lot of Chileans that questions, and they look at me saying, what do you mean? And why are you asking that question? That was even more important. In my opinion, there is a big mistake, because in a way we are not looking our history and some political issues which are common in all the countries. So, but I don't know why people are not really looking at themselves as Latin American people, but only people from the country. We don't really pay, as Chilean, we don't really pay attention to the neighbors, to the Peruvians, Bolivians, and Argentinians, and it's the same from those countries. But I would say there is something in common, and that thing probably is the history.
So on that note then, I mean, is it history that really does bind the region together, and is that recognized across the region in terms of the colonial heritage, for example? Or
and the foundations, the way that the whole part of the continent was treated by the Spaniards, I would say that made a big mark in our culture. But that is my personal opinion. I don't know if you agree with me.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, as any culture, I think the type of colonization that we got from Europe, which is very different from the colonization processes in the U.S. and Canada, for example, that is part of the equation. The fact that there were different types of communities that intersected there with the indigenous communities that were already there, the Spaniards and Portuguese and other Europeans that came with colonization, the Africans that came through the slave trade and all the mixing. There's also, I think one of the things that to me is more explains Latin America is that these different human communities actually ended up mixing and having children together and creating a new racial mix, which is the mestizo. And Marcelo and I are good examples of that. And you have people in Latin America that within the same family that are all shades within the same family, and that it's very different from here, where different human communities came to the United States, but they kind of stayed kind of segregated. In Latin America, there was a big mix from the very beginning, I mean, from the 1500s. And so that created a very different type of socializing, different type of relationship between people, different type of relationship between people and nature, because whatever the Africans brought with them is part of the culture, and whatever the Europeans brought with them. Religion, for example, I mean, people say that Latin American is Catholic, but that's not really true, because inside that Catholicism in Latin America, there's a lot of indigenous spirituality, and there's a lot of African spirituality. So it's like a Latin American invention that we call Catholic, but it has very little to do with the Catholicism in Rome.
Well, it depends on the region, because of course that is true in Mexico, Peru, Bolivia, but in Chile, Argentina, Catholic is very, I wouldn't say pure, but it's strange because it's a religion, but it's very flexible. So it's not the best way to define Latin America, near the language, probably the culture, and I would add the relationship with Spain during the 19th century and with this country, the States, during the 20th century. I think that is something very important for Latin American culture. But if you ask me for one or maybe a core that defines Latin American culture, it's very difficult to say something accurate.
Well, so last thing then, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that this region is very diverse. Each country is very diverse. The region is very diverse. It's made up of lots of people of lots of different backgrounds. And Clemency, even though you made some comparison to the United States, I mean, for my background is multiple different European predecessors, all of my ancestors were from different European backgrounds. So I think in some ways we have that in common, right? Is that those differences, those different peoples and societies that came together and created new societies elsewhere. And so that leads me to this last question. The impact, I mean, globalization as it is, there's a lot of travel, a lot of visiting, a lot of exporting of goods and services and things that culture in the sense of ideas, films, movies, literature, media of all kinds. So, are we now becoming perhaps more like one another than different from one another?
I don't think so. I think that there's a layer of homogeneity that if you look at, for example, what's on primetime TV in Colombia or even Chile and Norman, Oklahoma, it'll probably be very similar. But when you look at how young people are living their lives, what is happening in Latin America in terms of the new generations reinventing society and reinventing what they want to do with their lives. I don't see them. I see them that what they're doing down there is very different from, for example, my students here at the University of Oklahoma. If you compare the type of university student in Latin America, I don't see them as homogeneous. They listen to different music. They have different types of interaction with the media, even though they may watch, for example, something as simple as the Hunger Games, that was kind of a wave of enthusiasm here. I went to Colombia and I mentioned it, and no one knew what I was talking about. So it was in the theaters, it had been in the theaters, but no one really engaged with it that much. Yeah,
well, globalization is very tricky, in my opinion, because we have the sensation that we are in this huge village, which is the world. But at the same time, my feeling is that people are becoming more local, more isolated. And I think that is a serious problem now, especially among young people. Chileans, for example, they're always trying to be cool with technology, but at the same time, all the discussions are Chilean, about Chilean issues, Chilean problem, and very politics. So at the same, they have this access to the world through technology, but at the same time, the conversations are not global at all. So I don't know if that is a special or new phenomenon, but I think it's a serious problem in my opinion, and that is what is going on right now in Chile.
Thank you both for your perspectives on Latin American identity.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So students, tell us what you think. Now that you've learned a little bit about Latin American identity, what do you think about Latin American identity, society, and culture? What would you say if you were to see the world from a Latin American perspective? What might you view in terms of the relationship between that part of the world and other parts of the world? Let us know.